So for today I have chosen a book again to talk about. And this book I've had for many years. It's been on the shelf, occasionally picked up. Somehow it's one of those books that didn't get lost during my many travels in the past 30 years. And I've always loved this little book. When you take a book that you've had for a long time, you take it off the shelf and you notice that the edges are turning yellow, it means you're getting old. And so I looked and said, I've ever had this for such a long time? Wow, it's turning yellow. So this book is by a spiritual teacher, Kreshnamurti, whom some of you will be quite familiar with, and some of you may never have heard of him. Despite the name, he has nothing to do with Hare Krishna or anything like that. In fact, Krishnamurti was not aligned with any religion or school whatsoever. He was Indian, but he didn't teach Hindu philosophy or anything like that. So quite neutral teaching. He was born in 1895 and passed away in 1986. He has an interesting life history, which I won't talk about now, that would take too long. But he traveled around the world for 60 years talking, giving spiritual talks. He was brought up mostly in England, for early years in India, where he was born, and then in England for many years. And later on his home base was Ojai in California. There are many books by Krishnamurti. Most of the books were not written by him. They are skillfully edited transcripts of his talks. There are only about 2 books that were written by him, and one of those books is the book we're just going to look at today. It's called Krishnamurti's Notebook. And in 1961-62, the impulse came to him to get a notebook and write every day, make a few small short entries into his notebook every day. And he did that for a year and a half or so, and then suddenly stopped, and that was it. And the entries, I'm going to read a few to you today and comment on each one. They're all about the way in which he perceives nature, so many descriptions of nature. Nature perceived through his state of consciousness, of stillness. So to read those brief passages can also take you into stillness. And as we read them here, some passages together, that's an invitation for us to enter the same state of consciousness through which he perceived what he describes. And then he also speaks about his own state of consciousness. And he would often go into very deep states of stillness or presence, although he doesn't use the word presence. So he would talk about his state of consciousness at that moment. And basically, those are the two types of entries in the notebooks. Observations of nature against the background of intense presence, and direct observations and descriptions, to the extent to which it's possible, of his own state of consciousness. Krishnamurti was not an ordinary human being. He went through strange transformations and processes. For many years he had intense pain in his spine and in his head, which he attributed to a process. Some consciousness was doing something to him, transforming him. He never sought any medical help for it. So as we look at some of these passages, oh, by the way, there's another book called Krishnamurti's Journal, which again he did a little bit late, a few years after that. He also did this again. They're both good, but I think the notebook is deeper and probably better if you want to read one of them. And this is definitely not a book for continuous reading. This is a book you can open anywhere and read a page or even half a page, and that's enough. He traveled continuously, so he was always in each place for a month or 6 weeks and sometimes less. So some of the places he describes, he never says exactly where he is, but from the way in which he describes what he perceives, you can gather whether he is in Switzerland or in India or in Ohio or in England, wherever he happened to be, or Paris. I think those are the places that are described here. So I don't know where we'll start. I went through last night and marked a few passages. Let's start with something very simple. Well, it's all simple, but here he is in Paris, staying somewhere in Paris, where he gave a couple of talks, and he suddenly looks on a piece of grass, a lawn, and a rose bush, somewhere in the middle of the city, in a little park. A lawn, but he was brought up in England, where traditionally it's the old-fashioned, they say that a lawn needs to be tended and cared for a long, long time. So that's the traditional British belief, and it's only after 100 years or so that the lawn really becomes perfect. So you have to cut it and roll it and look after it, and so this kind of is what he also talks about. So here he is somewhere in the middle of Paris, and suddenly he looks at this little piece of lawn and a rose bush. There was a beautifully kept lawn, not too large, and it was incredibly green. It was behind an iron grill, well watered, carefully looked after, rolled and splendidly alive, sparkling in its beauty. It must have been many 100 years old. Not even a chair was on it, isolated and guarded by a high and narrow railing. At the end of the lawn was a single rose bush, with a single red rose in full bloom. It was a miracle, the soft lawn and the single rose. They were there apart from the whole world of noise, chaos and misery. Though man had put them there, they were the most beautiful things, far beyond the museums, towers and the graceful line of bridges. They were splendid in their splendid aloofness. They wear what they wear, grass and flower and nothing else. There was great beauty and quietness about them, and the dignity of purity. It was a hot afternoon, with no breeze, and the smell of exhaust of so many cars was in the air. But there the grass had a smell of its own, and one could almost smell the perfume of the solitary rose. So something that is ordinary one would completely overlook, because if you're in Paris, there are many more interesting things to look at than a little piece of lawn and a rose bush. But instead of focusing and writing about the spectacular things that you would usually focus on and look at in Paris, he never describes anything spectacular of that kind. He looked at this little, seemingly insignificant lawn and the rose bush and perceived it against that his inner stillness, and saw that intense aliveness which he's attempting to put into words. And it's as presence arises, you don't necessarily look for the spectacular. You see the extraordinary in the ordinary through presence. Without presence, to keep your life interesting, you need to look for something extraordinary. So that's why you're always somewhere else, because usually in the present moment, if you're not present, it's not that interesting unless you're having some drama. So you're looking for something bigger, something greater, some big thing to come into your life, continuously missing all the little things of which your life really consists. It's all little things. But if you continuously ignore the little things, then you ignore something very vital, the miracle of life all around you. So you may find this yourself when as you become present and you walk around, there's an acknowledgement of that extraordinariness of life, even in its seemingly most insignificant manifestations. And in fact, you become more interested in those things than in the big things. Often Krishnamurti would wake up in the night, early hours of the morning or night, like 4 o'clock, 4:30, and suddenly would go into intense presence, and he would perceive whatever was there to be perceived in the intense alertness. And he could be for an hour without any thought, just totally still. Here's a description of what happens when he's woken up by the cry of a bird in the middle of the night. It was long before dawn when the sharp cry of a bird woke up the night for an instant, and the light of that cry faded away. The light of that cry. Oh, by the way, he never uses the word I once in the whole notebook. He sometimes says one instead of I. One felt hot. Or sometimes he says you. You felt hot when he means I. It was long before dawn when the sharp cry of a bird woke up the night for an instant, and the light of that cry faded away. And the trees remained dark, motionless, melting into the air. It was a soft, quiet night, endlessly alive. It was awake. There was movement. There was a deep stirring with utter silence. Even the village next door, with its many dogs always barking, was quiet. It was a strange stillness, terribly potent, destructively alive. It was so alive and still that you were afraid to move, so your body froze into immobility, and the brain, which had awakened with that sharp cry of the bird, had become still, with heightened sensitivity. It was a brilliant night, with the stars in a cloudless sky. They seemed so close, and the Southern Cross was just over the trees, sparkling in the warm air. That was obviously in India somewhere. So reading this is an invitation really to join him in that state of consciousness, of that alert stillness or presence. And not only as you read or listen, when I read it to you, it may also help you to, as you go about your life, to pay more attention to the seemingly insignificant, the little things, the miracle that's hiding in everything. A brief description here of the inner state that is the prerequisite for perceiving things in that always fresh, new way. What was necessary was a very sensitive, alert brain. He calls it brain, you could say mind, you could say consciousness. What was necessary was a very sensitive, alert brain which had stopped entirely, willingly and easily its chatter. It had become very quiet, the brain, the mind. It had become very quiet, seeing and listening without interpreting, without classifying. It was quiet, and there was no entity or necessity to make it quiet. The brain was very still and very alive. That immensity filled the night, and there was bliss. And sometimes he perceived, it only describes his state of consciousness, it is as if his state of consciousness he also experienced it as being outside. And then he uses the term, when he suddenly says, the room suddenly was filled with, or the entire landscape suddenly became filled with, and he sometimes calls it the immensity, or he calls it the otherness, or he calls it the sacredness. This brief description here is probably in Switzerland. In the morning, walking in the woods above the stream, with the sun on every tree, again it was there, that immensity, so unexpected, so still, that one walked through it, marveling. A single leaf was dancing rhythmically, and the rest of the abundant leaves were still. It was there, that love that's not within the scope of man's longing and measure. It was there, and thought could blow it away, and a feeling could push it away. It was there, never to be conquered, never to be caught. And then he has second thoughts. He talks about the word to feel. The word to feel is misleading. It's more than emotion. It's more than a sentiment, than an experience, than touch or smell. Though that word is apt to be misleading, it must be used to communicate, and especially so when we are talking of essence. So he is struggling to find the right words to communicate that experience. And the word comes to him to feel, and then says, well, it's not quite right, but we have to use it. And now here in this, suddenly the word essence comes to him, which he doesn't pick up again. It's here a couple of times and then never uses it again. But I love that, and I use that myself occasionally. He talks of the feel of essence is not through the brain nor through some fancy. It's not experienceable as a shock. Above all, it's not the word. You cannot experience it. To experience, there must be an experiencer, the observer. Experiencing without the experiencer is quite another matter. It is in this state, in quotation marks, in which there is no experiencer, no observer, that there is that feeling, in quotation marks. It is not intuition which the observer interprets or follows blindly or with reason. It is not the desire, longing transformed into intuition, or the voice of God evoked by politicians and religio-social reformers. To feel demands the austerity of clarity, in which there is no confusion and conflict. The feeling of essence is the negation of thought. The feeling of essence is the negation of thought. The negation of thought, he uses that occasionally. It's if you're able to realize what he means by that, then you can truly know what that is. To negate thought means to say no to thought, to eliminate thought when it's not required. And if you're able to do that, it's not a doing. If you're able to do that, that is an incredible thing to be able to do. To negate thought is to simply, he almost talks it in terms of distraction, to eliminate thought, and then something else arises, something else is there that is infinitely more powerful than thought. but without which thought could not be, without which perceptions could not be. So it's almost as if that essence, whenever thinking arises or sense perception arises and so on, is the same essence that becomes diluted. I'm putting it like that. That essence becomes diluted and it becomes multiplicity of mind forms and physical forms. And that becomes the world. But to encounter that essence in its undiluted, so to speak, in its undiluted non-form, that is spiritual true realization. And because that is the realization of the One. Now, it's not, you can no longer say that here is somebody who realizes the One, because and this is why he says the experiencer and the experience, they become a single thing. You cannot say, I experience the One, because that would be duality. So the One experiences itself. It would be closer to the truth. And that's all the ancient and more recent teachings. The essence is really transcendence of thought. Not just in those moments when nothing is happening to challenge you, but also in situations, so that you can more and more embody that state of presence rather than the state of mind. So the feeling of essence, what I call essence identity and form identity. The question is, at this moment, can you sense your essence identity as the simple fact of the beingness of, or the consciousness, whatever you want to call it, the isness of you, the I am? Forget all about your history, your personal history, your name. It's nothing to do with it. Just what's left when that's gone. What is more, what is deeper than that? Just that simple spaciousness. Just that. That's, I call it sometimes inner space. If you could deal with things in life without loss of awareness of that inner space, embodying that inner space, and still pick up the phone and say, you overcharged me on my credit card. Or you delivered the wrong thing, I never ordered that, and you charged me $5,000 for it. Or whatever it is that you are dealing with that tends to draw you into complete identification, and you lose yourself in ultimately totally and absolutely insignificant things, and you give it an importance that it cannot possibly have. And you suffer because you do that. And you suffer because you lose that sense of essence of who you truly are, the essence of. And if you don't lose that, then you don't lose yourself in the things anymore. You can deal with things without losing it. There is a space around them, and you can deal with. It's fine. Much more effectively. And then you can visit your parents and still feel that essence. And then you run into your ex and still feel that. That means it's already very strong in you. It has to be. And now he wakes up again in the middle of the night. Waking up again in the middle of the night, when it was quiet after thunder and lightning, the brain was utterly still, and meditation was an opening into immeasurable emptiness. When he uses the word meditation, by the way, he doesn't mean meditation. He means presence, because he's not doing a meditation. So again, in the middle of the night, when it was quiet after thunder and lightning, the brain was utterly still, and meditation, or presence, was an opening into immeasurable emptiness. The very sensitivity of the brain made it still. It was still for no cause. The action of stillness with cause is disintegration. It was so still that the limited space of a room had disappeared and time had stopped. There was only an awakened attention with a center which was attentive. It was the attention in which the origin of thought had ceased, without any violence, naturally, easily. It could hear the rain and movement in the next room. It was listening without any interpretation and watching without knowledge. The body was also motionless. Meditation, presence, yielded to the otherness. It was of shattering purity. Its purity left no residue. It was there. That is all, and nothing existed. As there was nothing, it was. It was the purity of all essence. This peace is vast, boundless space of immeasurable emptiness. Again, when he says meditation, remember he really means presence. Meditation is the emptying the mind of all thought. For thought and feeling dissipate energy. They are repetitive, producing mechanical activities which are a necessary part of existence, but they are only part, and thought and feeling cannot possibly enter into the immensity of life. Quite a different approach is necessary. Not the path of a habit, association, and the known. There must be freedom from these. One of the most accessible books by Krishnamurti is called Freedom from the Known. If you haven't read any, that's a very good book to start. Freedom from the Known. And here he talks about it again. What does that mean? It means to be able to step out of thought, because thought is the known. Thought is knowledge. So freedom from the known is really also means freedom from thought. Meditation is the emptying of the mind of the known. It cannot be done by thought or by the hidden prompting of thought, nor by desire in the form of prayer, nor through the self-effacing hypnotism of words, images, hopes, and vanities. All these have to come to an end easily, without effort and choice, in the flame of awareness. And there, walking on that road, there was complete emptiness of the brain, and the mind was free of all experience, the knowing of yesterday, though 1,000 yesterdays have been. Time, the thing of thought, had stopped. Literally, there was no movement before and after. There was no going or arriving or standing still. Space as distance was not. There were the hills and bushes, but not as high and low. There was no relationship with anything, but there was an awareness of the bridge and the passer-by. The totality of the mind, in which is the brain with its thoughts and feelings, was empty. And because it was empty, there was energy, a deepening and widening energy without measure. All comparison, measurement belonged to thought, and so to time. The otherness was the mind without time. It was the breath of innocence and immensity. Words are not reality. They are only means of communication, but they are not the innocence and the immeasurable. The emptiness was alone. And in between readings, as we're not waiting for anything, just notice the stillness here, within and without. Just acknowledge it. There's stillness. Giving it attention. And already it deepens. If you give it attention, if you just notice it, it deepens. And then it becomes, you can sense there's a power within it. It is power itself, of course, because it is the essence of all life. Another thing in the middle of the night here, his favorite time. A deep-throated owl was hooting in the hills. Its deep voice penetrated the room and quickened hearing. Except for these hoots, everything was still. There was not even the croak of a frog or the rustle of some passing animal. The silence intensified between the hoots, which came from the southern hills. They filled the valley and the hills, and the air throbbed with the call. It wasn't answered for a very long time, and when it came, it was way down the valley to the west. Between them, they held the silence and the beauty of the night. Dawn would come presently, but now it was dark. You could see the outlines of the hill and that huge banyan tree. The Pleiades and Orion were setting in a clear, cloudless sky. The air was fresh by a short shower of rain. It had a perfume that comes of old trees, rain, flowers, and very ancient hills. Now, to express this, he uses these words: to see wholly, A-W-H-O, wholly, totally. To see wholly, the brain has to be in a state of negation. Negation is not the opposite of the positive. All opposites are related within the fold of each other. Negation has no opposite. The brain has to be in a state of negation for total seeing. It must not interfere with its evaluations and justifications, with its condemnations and defenses. It has to be still, not made still by compulsion of any kind, for then it is a dead brain, merely imitating and conforming. When it is in a state of negation, it is choicelessly still. Only then is there total seeing. In this total seeing, which is the quality of the mind, there is no seer, no observer, no experiencer. There is only seeing. The mind then is completely awake.